Hi there, everyone. Welcome to another week of ethics. We are flying through this course, and it's hard for me to believe. We made a turn. So we had started the course thinking about what ethics was, and then I was having you think about some of these examples that I told you we're going to put in brackets and we'll come back to. They're going to be super important for your final project, for example. Now we're thinking about theories. And remember, these theories are trying to identify things that are intrinsically valuable. The goal of these moral theories is finding that which is intrinsically valuable. What does it mean to be intrinsically valuable? It means that something is not valuable because it helps you get something else. Those sort of good things are instrumentally valuable, right? Taking this class, I suppose for most of you, is instrumentally valuable for you to learn more about ethics, to think more about what you care about, to think more about your ethical obligations, to get a humanities credit, to get an associate's degree, to get the nursing degree, whatever it is. Actually sort of taking this section of this philosophy class is probably not the ultimate good in the world to which like all of your other desires should be aimed towards. Remember, it was like that chain of things, right? So it was not only that you get an A, but so that you could be an honor student, so that you could get a degree, so you could get a job, so you could support people, because for some reason you have obligations to support people you care about, right? That's what intrinsically valuable things are. And this whole game of moral theories, will remember, is sort of project of normative ethics. So normative ethics is the area of ethics where we are making moral theories about what is always right or good, the ultimate good in all cases, the thing that is intrinsically valuable, using these things called moral theories. This is different than applied ethics, where you're looking at very specific examples and you're trying to decide in these examples the right thing to do. First was egoism. Remember, egoism thought that the intrinsically valuable thing, the thing all our desires are centered towards, are the self. The thinker we looked at was Ayn Rand, but egoists sort of believe that you have the ethical obligation to pursue your own self-interest. It's worth noting here, I had someone bring to my attention that just because you should do something or you have an obligation to do something, all of these theories recognize you sometimes might do the unethical thing, right? So it is, you do have an ethical obligation to do what is in your self-interest. However, it's possible you do an action that's not in your self-interest. What these theories would say when you do something that is not the intrinsic value under the moral theory, what they would say is you're doing something you shouldn't do. You're doing something unethical, so to say. Egoism, remember, said the intrinsic value, the thing that is the most good, the ultimate good, or the thing that should direct our lives is the promotion of our own self-interest. Then we looked at hedonism. In the reading for today, you'll notice that hedonism and pleasure got used interchangeably. That's actually because like not all languages make certain distinctions between those words, I don't think. The distinction in English, at least modern English, seems to be pretty minimal. Um, Most of our authors mean the same thing, at least, when they talk about both of those things, okay? Some languages, for example, when we look at Aristotle next week, Aristotle talks about a type of happiness that we don't make the distinction in our own language on, right? So in his ancient Greek language, he had a different word than the word we have today. The idea was the intrinsically valuable thing to which we should all seek our interests towards was happiness or pleasure. That is the most good thing in life. And there was a lot of really cool arguments for this, right? So things like you wish that your loved ones have a happy life. It seems that we all seem to pursue happiness. Like there was a lot of really cool arguments here. But we ended on a point where we were somewhat unsatisfied because we said on that understanding you would be able to get a lobotomy. That was a argument our author gave, who was in reference to Philippa Foot, who was a 20th century philosopher. Another 20th century philosopher was Nozick. We talked about the experience machine briefly in lecture, and you all did a discussion board post thinking about whether or not you would be willing to step into the experience machine. Hedonism, which is more popular than egoism, I at least know there are philosophers who think hedonism is the actual accurate moral theory. I've yet to meet personally an egoist. It does still leave little things to be satisfied. In this first week, these are sort of the elementary theories that very few students seem to grab onto, and that also much fewer philosophers seem to also defend themselves. So that's where we start this week. In your reading, you had a quick summary again of what hedonism was. The super important thing to take from that hedonism was the value of pleasure and happiness. That is going to come up again this week with utilitarianism. And just know that the distinction between pleasure and happiness that maybe you could make or that comes to your mind is not relevant for our class. I'm going to use these words interchangeably. And what I mean by these words for utilitarianism, as defined by Jeremy Bentham, who is the philosopher that we're going to talk about this week, the definition I'm giving to this word is an experience welcomed or enjoyed when experienced. What does that mean? You can imagine that there are some things that you could experience that you don't like, right? If you aren't a masochist, when you are in pain, which is sort of the antonym to pleasure, when you're in pain, you're experiencing something that you do not enjoy and that you wouldn't electively welcome. And so the way that Bentham is going to be defining pleasure and happiness, so he's going to say this idea, which is rooted in the ancient Greek philosophical tradition, uses pleasure and happiness to be sort of the ultimate goal of life. And what really do they mean when they say happiness or pleasure? They mean those experiences which we would welcome or enjoy when we experience them. Great. So now we have our idea for this week, which is utilitarianism. This is a big word, and I actually bet a lot of you have heard of it before. Utilitarianism is honestly probably one of the most famous ethical theories that exist. It is really potent, really present in the literature. I mean, especially when Mill developed Bentham, who is the person we read after Bentham. Once he sort of expanded on these ideas, it became at least a dominant idea in the culture that major ethicists and philosophers have had to deal with ever since. It is a really good argument that a lot of people are convinced by. And even if you aren't convinced by it, a lot of people think that you still have to deal with it for some reason. So for that reason, I think a lot of us have heard of utilitarianism. I already mentioned his name, but the thinker we're going to discuss is Jeremy Bentham. And Jeremy Bentham is the father of utilitarianism. He is the gentleman who creates the word utilitarianism. The book Utilitarianism is written by Mill. Bentham was writing immediately in the post-French Revolution era. So we're post-Enlightenment, we're post-French Revolution, post-American Revolution. The world is changing around us. And suddenly, philosophers actually have a lot more freedom to discuss their ideas. Bentham also grew up personally impacted by a sort of English Civil War that happens in the 1800s. That's kind of relevant for you to know because Bentham describes that experience as super formative for him in his literature that we did not read for this class. And Bentham is actually one of the first major atheist philosophers that we see in the Western tradition, the Western canon. So this guy named Bentham develops what we call the classic theory of utilitarianism. This is also called act utilitarianism. That term doesn't come until later in the philosophical literature. So Bentham and his contemporaries would have called it classic utilitarianism. But Bentham is this philosopher, and he's interested in the ancient Greeks and this idea of hedonism. And he thinks that hedonism has fallen out of favor too quickly, and that it actually is something super interesting that we should reconsider. So Bentham steps back and he says, why do we care about actions? Why is it that we do anything at all? Why do I teach this class? Why do I think about the trolley problem and whose lives I save? Why do I care about euthanasia? Why do I care about sweatshops? Why was any of that relevant to me? Bentham says that choices like this, the reason we create theories to think about is there has to be a thing of utility. Utility. So notice it's at the root here of utilitarianism, utility. And Jeremy Bentham says, so the first thing he identifies is we need theories that have utility. That means I need to be able to use my theories for something. He starts by stealing hedonism's concept of happiness or pleasure. So the utility of an action is first determined by how much pleasure it gives me minus how much pain it gives me. The goal is to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. And that quote in our reading, he says so. He wants to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. He uses the fancy word axiom. Axiom is a fancy word for standard, but he says the axiom of our ethical actions should be to promote the greatest pleasure for the greatest number of people in order to act morally. We earn no pleasure. Remember, he thinks that there has to be utility, have to be tools to help us seek this goal of pleasure. So he adds something else to pleasure. He adds what we call consequentialism. Already I've thrown a lot of big words at you. Utilitarianism, consequentialism. There's a lot going on. Let's take a moment. Breathe. You already know this concept. I've already introduced it to you without you knowing. When we thought about sweatshops, there was this issue where a lot of us thought working in the sweatshop was unethical or unpreferable. The act of sweatshop labor was immoral. It was not good or valuable that these people worked in sweatshops. So why did some people think we should have sweatshops anyway? The consequences of those acts. Have you ever heard the phrase, the ends justify the means? That's a philosophical saying that says, as long as you get to the place you want to go, it doesn't matter how you get there. I don't care who I have to run over as long as I get to the goal I want to get to. You might also think about this. Sometimes you might lie to someone to protect them, or because you think that that lying is actually the better thing to do. Why might you do that? Because what we do subconsciously is we don't only think about the act itself and the ethical permissibility of acts by themselves, we also think about how our acts actually manifest into things in the real world. We think about their consequences. That's what makes consequentialism. Utilitarianism is built on this theory of utility. And Bentham says utility uses pleasure as the principle and consequentialism as the measure. Let's think about that. For the hedonist, when you had to make a decision about what you should do, you asked yourself, will this give me pleasure? Will this give me more pleasure? Bentham says you don't just do what you find pleasurable. You have to do what creates the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest number of people. That's to say, the consequences of your action determine the ethical permissibility, whether or not it is the right thing to do. Because our decisions now are not just based alone on considerations of my self-interest or what I think is pleasurable. But now my decisions, this theory is a tool for me to seek a greater goal than a principle. My greater goal for Bentham is the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest number of people. He says hedonism was onto something. The real change here is that you have to think about the pleasure of all people. And you not only have to think about this action, you have to think about the consequences of your action. This might be a little convoluted, so let me back it up. First week in this class, I had you look at the trolley problem. The trolley problem is an excellent way to demonstrate this. So let's remember the trolley problem. I have this orange path and I have this pink path. And there is one person here on the pink path, and there's 3 people here on the orange path, we'll say. And there's a trolley coming, and I'm standing back here, and I have a lever, and I can make the trolley go from the orange path onto the pink path. And I asked you guys, you might have to take responsibility for having killed someone, which is not great, but you save a greater number of lives. That was a hard decision for you. But let's imagine I could interview all of these people. And let's say these were all utilitarians. All of these people in this scenario are utilitarian. And I pause time, the trolley's not moving. Remember, a trolley's like a fancy train car. And I go, do you think I should pull the lever? All of these people are going to say, you should pull the lever, because remember, the train's going to hit them if I don't pull the lever. They're going to say, you should pull the lever, because there are 3 of us. If you pull the lever, only 1 person dies. You're probably like, yeah, that makes sense. Of course they want to save their life. Well, let's say this person truly was utilitarian. And remember, what does utilitarian care about? The greatest pleasure for the greatest number of people. Pleasure meaning an experience welcomed or enjoyed when experienced. Doesn't necessarily mean it's excitement or physical pleasure or that giddy feeling you get when you're super happy, super content, when you're super gregarious, lively. It doesn't mean any of that. It just means that you either welcome or don't welcome the experience. Those experiences which you would be willing to welcome, like continuing to live, is under Bentham's definition of pleasure. Let's say this person here really is utilitarian and they really think it's important that they maximize the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest number of people. This is really utilitarian. They're going to say, pull the lever and kill me. If this person really cared about maximizing the greatest number of pleasure for the greatest number of people, they make their decisions based on the utility of their action. What was the utility of the action? The ability to give pleasure to the most amount of people. So their action of advocating to die, to have the train, for me to pull the lever, for the trolley to hit them instead, their action has utility because it helps give more pleasure to more people. And that was the thing that was valuable, that they cared about under Bentham's utilitarianism theory. To make it a little more complicated, if it turns out these 3 people were murderers and this was a doctor, but they were all truly utilitarianisms, they all just became utilitarian, because I don't know if you could be a utilitarian murderer. A utilitarian would say, no, one person who saves lives and gives more people pleasure is more valuable than 3 people that will end lives. They're doing what we call calculus, and I'll talk more about this in a moment, but they're literally calculating the amount of pleasure minus the amount of pain, the amount of welcomed experiences minus the amount of unwelcomed experiences. I don't think it's mentioned in the book, but it's a classic example, is the utilitarian doctor. So with the utilitarian doctor, a patient comes into a hospital, and let's say they have an ear infection. Utilitarian doctor would kill them, harvest their organs, so that they could give a heart to a patient who needs a heart, a liver, a kidney, eyes, skin, all of the organs that could be. He would kill him to give the most amount of people organs. But the idea is, the thing you should care about is giving the most amount of people the most amount of welcome experiences. Bentham just calls that utility. He says that is a tool I can make my decisions with that actually is something bigger than myself. Here's what's really cool about this theory that our author points out. It's both impartial and relative. What does that mean? Impartial means there is an objective right and wrong. Under utilitarianism, you have the obligation to do the right thing, which is the action which would cause the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest number of people. Your obligation is to pull the lever in our first example, not to pull the lever when he was a doctor, or to kill the patient who came into the hospital for ear infection so you could save 10 lives. There was an objective right and wrong, but it also gets to be relative in that some people welcome experiences that others do not welcome. The example Bentham gives is masochism. So if one person welcomes pain and gets gratification from pain, that doesn't mean everyone has to welcome pain. Individuals still get to have psychologies or personalities that prefer certain experiences over others. Think about it this way. You're calculating my pleasure minus my pain plus the pleasure of this person minus their pain plus infinite for all humans alive right now. The pleasure of all humans minus the pain of all humans. The maximum amount of pleasure, the highest amount of pleasure we could possibly imagine. That is the intrinsic good. That is the goal. And so I should do things, I should choose actions. My actions should maximize that number, highest amount of pleasure I can get, causing the least amount of pain. It's impartial. Objectively, there's a right thing to do. It is objective. It doesn't matter what I want to do. There is something that I have an obligation to. There's this thing called the felicific. If you know what the word felicity means, it means like happiness. You don't have to know that word. It's also called hedonistic calculus. Bentham says you could literally calculate like a math problem the amount of pleasure, pain a thing causes. This is a tool for decision making to analyze your actions. That was the intensity of the pain or pleasure, the duration of the pain and pleasure, the certainty of the pain and pleasure, the remoteness of the pain and pleasure. By remoteness, he means how far into the future or how far into the past the pain or pleasure will occur. Because if it will cause you pain to wait for the pleasurable experience, you might be justified to do the pleasurable experience in the now. That was fecundity. Fecundity means the ability of one action to have the consequence of more positive actions. So if I do something that right now gives me more pleasure, but it turns out it'll cause more pain in the long run, I should not do that action. The purity, which is to what extent there is no pain in the action, and the extent, which is the amount of people impacted by the action. You do not need to know all of those things that go into the hedonistic calculus. Here's what I do want you to know. Bentham is saying the right thing to do is always the thing that causes the most amount of pleasure and the least amount of pain. Here's the other unintuitive part of this. You might have the right intention. You might hope to cause someone pleasure, but if you come to find out you've caused them less pleasure than you imagined, or that there was another option available to you that would have caused them more pleasure, your intention doesn't matter whatsoever. All that matters is the consequence of your actions. It is purely objective. Bentham thinks of it like a math problem. It does not matter who you are, why you did an action. It doesn't matter if your society told you you should do that action. It didn't matter if you thought this action was reputable. None of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was looking at the consequences of the action. Did you give the greatest amount of pleasure to the greatest number of people? If you accidentally gave the greatest amount of pleasure to the greatest number of people, you did the right thing. You could accidentally do the right thing. If you tried your best to do the right thing and there was still something you could have done to give more pleasure to more people, you did not do the right thing. This theory I already mentioned was really prolific. And you have to think this was coming on the edge of Enlightenment Revolution. This is one of the first major atheist philosophies of ethics. And so it became very popular in the 19th century, that's the 1800s. And also, frankly, most governments and most social groups function on a utilitarian model, right? So, for example, if there was a natural disaster, a hurricane was coming to an area, you would ask yourself, what is the goal of the government? To save the greatest amount of people.